Welcome, Northeastern tree fruit workers. Listen in while experts discuss what's on their mind this week, the fourth week of April 2021. Apple was at pink in many regions of New York and Quebec, peaches blooming in many regions. Long Island and New England were less advanced in apples, mostly tight cluster. We're getting some cold temperatures in most regions, but most folks are pulling through okay. Stick around for a discussion about temperature, duration of threatening temperatures, and relative humidity about 10 minutes in. Also, stay tuned for a bit of discussion comparing apple scab ascospore maturation models. In a nutshell, RimPro's model is matching what pathologists are seeing in terms of actual spore discharge in the field. In some cases, that spore discharge can start before the biofix in some models. So setting a conservative biofix in the newer models might be a smart way to go. And by that, I mean set the bud break a few days earlier before pink. And that will be a more conservative way to assess risk in apple scab. Protecting peach trees from brown rot infections remains a concern. Stay tuned for discussion about 18 minutes in about potential benefits of fungicide use after shuck split and which products to use. There could be some benefits, especially if there are issues with peach scab or rusty spot, some unusual ones. Avoid using Abound anywhere near apple trees. Several apple varieties are very sensitive to spray injury to this fungicide. Abound is the active ingredient is azoxystrobin, which is found in Abound, registered for use on peaches or grapes. But this active ingredient can be found in several products that are registered for use around the farm, particularly if you grow a lot of pumpkins, something to think about. The Pseudomonas pathogens that cause blossom blast, bacterial canker, and blister spot tend to thrive in cool bloom seasons like the one we're experiencing now. Blossom blast infections in apple can look a lot like fire blight later in the season, so make sure you know how to tell the difference. Apricots are particularly sensitive to Pseudomonas infections, and apricots are also particularly sensitive to sulfur, so be forewarned. It will stop growth in its tracks if applied to apricots. Stay tuned for management recommendations around 25 minutes into our discussion. For those of you affected by oblique-banded leafroller, think about scouting blooming flower clusters to trigger the use of LEP-targeted dipel. That's the Bacillus thuringiensis. That's only effective on lepidopterans, so caterpillars. You may want to hold off until summer for Delegate, which is a bigger gun, but certainly pricier. Stay tuned for a discussion about 35 minutes in on interpreting trapping data for summer management decisions and why oblique-banded leafroller outbreaks are so spotty. Unfortunately, mating disruption is not an option for oblique-banded leafroller because they can fly in from farther afield than other pest insects where mating disruption is a real option, like peach tree borer, oriental fruit moth, or codling moth, for example. There's a bit of discussion about using mating disruption and a sail as components for a Lorsban alternative program for dogwood borer in apple, about 45 minutes in. There's also a discussion of quince rust, cousin of cedar apple rust, about 50 minutes in. It's an unusual one, but a slow-moving disease, so kickback goes pretty far back. At the very end of our discussion, around 55 minutes in, there is a debate about using Belief for tarnish plant bug at pink, as this product has the highest rating in terms of efficacy and least chance of flaring mites, the way that pyrethroid products will. A little pricey, but might be more valuable for plant bug attacking peaches. Something to think about.
So in Rhode Island, it's pretty much the same as far as we're at like tight cluster to early pink. And then, as you say, the whole region seems to be at this about the same stage. And usually in Rhode Island, we have very coastal areas, and then we've got inland, and they can be a couple weeks apart, and everybody seems to be about the same. So it also peculiar. And then I'm thinking that we really haven't had a serious scab infection yet. I know we're just talking phenology, but I'm thinking that this coming weekend, maybe Sunday, will be our real first serious scab infection. So that's nice.
Yeah, that's the same in Mass.
Yeah.
That's one point that I am curious how different we are, because in terms of pheno, we're all at par, but in terms of my ejections in the lab, I'm seeing record ejections. I've never seen so many ascospores ejected at such an early stage. So every year we run these tower trappings, and I'm in the thousands of ascospores ejected. So last weekend, which was there was a relatively severe infection event for us, and we called it that it was an important one based on all the spores we were catching. So I'm not sure if you guys run such tower traps. I heard from Elizabeth that she was behind, but have you did you catch up on those ejections, or?
She's been up and down, Vincent, I don't know if that's a artifact of where she's keeping her leaves, which is basically out in the field at her house, or what. But anyway, and the other thing is we're not using any suction. There's no air. It's just, I think she's using just a passive petri dish approach to the ejections too, and maybe that's making a difference as well. What did your RimPro stuff in up your way look like last?
Well, we based the biofix on our first lab ejections, like we always do, which is when was the first mature spore ready to shoot? That's when we put our biofix, and RimPro was right on the dot. That the last weekend ejection was a huge one. It paralleled the potential spores that are ready to shoot was paralleled in the model for sure, and I'm happy we called it a major event. But I'm, in the call last week, we didn't speak so much about how many mature spores were out there, but since then we run it weekly, and I haven't seen such high numbers. I was like, wow, thousands of spores. Yeah.
Well, I haven't checked in with Liz this week, so I don't know what she's gotten. I'll have to double check.
Vincent, was your biofix ahead of green tip?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So usually I think, surgeon would run the tower for us and see when those spores are first mature in Eastern New York, but we weren't able to do that this year. So we were kind of just rolling with the usual sort of set your biofix at green tip. Is that usually close, or is it usually more like what you're seeing, Vincent, where it can be a bit ahead?
Well, I mean, we run these ejections every year. We have been for the last 20 years. And in years where the ascospores are delayed, there's no consequence to the grower. He starts spraying at bud break. I mean, few extra sprays for nothing, possibly. But ascospores can be ahead of bud break, and by a good margin. And we've seen that in a few years. And in those years, I was very happy that we had these spore counts to tell us that the spores are ahead of the pheno of the tree.
Vincent, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I was thinking last couple of weeks that if I was running RimPro without a biofix based on spore releases, I would probably set the biofix about 4 to 5 days ahead of green tip, because then it'll definitely give you a safe estimate. It may, but then once I got to about pink or so, I'd probably move it back to green tip, and that way you can sort of jigger the program to give you conservative readings in the pre-bloom period, and then put it back so you're not accidentally terminating too early. And I don't know if other people using RimPro have used that approach or not.
They do, where they have no information on ascospores. This is something that is done, not something that Mark likes a lot, but yes, it's been reported. We have their ejection, so I don't feel the need to play with the biofix around during the season. But in regions that they don't have that, they apply exactly the same approach. Be conservative, put the biofix ahead, and then play with it. Yeah.
So one more
Pragmatic.
question about your discharge. Is there a possibility that you just had unusually scabby or fertile leaves this year compared to other leaves? Because whenever you do leaf discharges, it so much depends on what was in those leaves in the fall.
Yeah, for sure. Every year we use a standardized sort of pool of leaves that we scatter in the different regions, and so the same leaf scab leaf inventory is used in the different regions, and then the samples are brought back to to my lab in the spring. So I understand that this original inventory, of course, can vary in scab levels a lot, but we pick scabby leaves, and we, and then it's a question of how favorable was the winter for the scab pool. But just to be sure, it's winterized in the different orchards, and I have a extra leaves that I keep and I winterize in my lab under artificial winter conditions in my lab, and I compare all of them. So we got a good grasp on that system. We know what these numbers mean year after year.
For growers that might be using the system and aren't able to determine their maturity, in like a mild winter year, or where we've had a couple of those warm spells, would you set it a few days even earlier, or can they kind of make those adjustments? Or if you had to make that sort of practical recommendation to people?
Well, the practical, if it was wet at the end of the winter, early spring before bug break, if it was wet, then the odds are that the ascospore is already ahead of bug break. That's the.
Yeah, I think the other thing that may come into play, and perhaps not so much in your northern areas, is how much snow cover you had in winter. Because if we have an open winter where the leaves are crispy dry from wind desiccation, that slows down the process, even if it gets wet later. But if you have snow cover and then a wet spring with a lot of, so the leaves never dry out, because the drying of the leaf litter is what really slows the process. And if it's ideal conditions in terms of moisture in the leaves, I think David Gaduri used to say, if the leaves bend instead of breaking, then there's plenty of moisture in there for ascospores to proceed in their development. But if you pick up leaf litter and it crumbles in your hand because it's so crunchy dry, then probably not much is happening in terms of maturation. But how you integrate that over a 2-month period or more is, I don't think anybody has a handle on that.
Okay, great.
Mike, before we get too deep in the weeds, you asked the question originally, what happens usually? I think the practical answer is sort of Dave's: set things a little early and you'll be safe. But there really isn't a usual. I mean, it can go either way.
Yeah, if I've learned anything, just a couple of years I've been in my position, there's no usual. So it's hard to really give a blanket type of recommendation. Thanks, Dan.
I would say that the growers are happy that we provide this information, because in the years that it's early, they want to know that they need to be on that sprayer early. And the years that it's late, they're happy that they have this leeway and that they have a little bit more time to organize. So, they keep asking for this year after year. I tried to quit and they wouldn't let me. So.
You need to find a Liz.
Well, I don't do it personally. It's Valentin that does it, but it's not something that we can say, okay, let's stop doing that.
Sure, I think that was a real benefit when Surgeon was doing that for us as well. So I guess maybe we can shift gears a little. Do we want to talk a little bit about peach scab and brown rot? And I know Janet had a few questions for the group on peach diseases.
I also just pulled up that there was a question in the chat about temperature for peach damage. So I just pulled up on my screen like that classic temperature, how cold it has to get for how much damage. So I'm just going to stick that into the chat. But I also, I mean, I'm guessing maybe you've seen this before. But it looks like mid-20s is basically your cutoff as sort of like a rubric. I'm not a horticulturist, so if anybody else wants to speak to this more than I can, but I just figured since it was there.
Did anybody get down near that? We were running in Western Mass, and I think no colder in Massachusetts in general than 31, maybe 30. Where peaches are grown. I mean, we got down, some places in the hills got 28, 29.
Charts are so much missing how long it stays at these temperatures, because I think that that's key, and I don't see charts that include time as well as low temperatures.
I think my understanding was they did it for 30 minutes when they made that original temperature information, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
I'm also under the impression that the relative humidity or moisture on the buds at the time of the freeze may have an impact. I've never been quite clear on what impact that is, if any. I think that most of those charts were developed in the West Coast, and they tend to have really low humidity. So I'm not sure if they always hold in our situations if we have more moisture in the air, or even more so if there's been a little bit of rain and the tissue is still wet when it freezes.
Yeah, I think there's so many of those different variables. Another being, how fast is it to thaw out after the cold? There's a really good article that Rob Crasweller from Penn State put together that went through the Great Lakes Fruit Workers email chain last week. I can find that and pull that link too. He kind of discusses a lot of those different topics.
So Mike, if the damage, let's say 30 to 40% damage in peaches, is that will there's another 6% good undamaged bud there? So is that will impact the yield if 30% losses due to the cold damage, 30% bud, is that will impact the overall yield? Can the plant compensate? How will you can compensate? By thinning, less thinning, or something like this? Is there anyone can chime on this?
Faruque, I think growers would pay you a lot of money if you could get them a 40% frost damage every year, because it reduces their thinning cost. Okay. So the best years are when you take out some of those flowers with a freeze, and you don't need to thin nearly as much. The problem is that it rarely freezes just the right amount.
So it's like when it freezes, it's damaged a lot. It looks like.
No, but I mean, it's just so unpredictable. But I've seen years where frost took out almost exactly the right amount of peaches and nectarines, so the thinning was very minimal, and that's perfect, because thinning is, I mean, there's not a good mechanical or chemical way of thinning peaches. It's a lot of hand labor. And I think in general, either by pruning or thinning, growers are probably taking off 80 to 90% of the peaches. I don't have data on that, but between, eliminating some shoots that would fruit and then hand thinning the remaining ones, peaches really tend to overcrop.
Okay.
What about a grower in my region was saying recently that he holds off on pruning the top half of the tree until after the last potential frost, with the idea that even if the bottom part gets frosted out, the top shoots will still produce fruit. But then if they don't get frosted, he can come back through and prune those out later.
That's been pretty common during the time frame I was working in the Hudson Valley. One of the dilemmas, though, is that if you do that year after year, soon you need 15-foot ladders to pick your peaches, because so in some cases where you do that for 2 years, your crop keeps moving up, and if you don't prune out the tops, it shades the center of the tree, so now you lose your potentially fruiting wood in the bottom of the tree. So there's some possibilities there, but it has limitations as well. Concerning peach scab, I haven't reviewed that lately, and I think you said Mike had sent some information, but in my experience, that's was a problem primarily where growers got through bloom and said, well, I don't have to apply a fungicide until the peaches start to ripen, or they were applying ineffective fungicides, because I think most of the peach scab infections on the fruit occur starting around, a little after shuck split. The fruit aren't exposed before that. And that's often when growers feel they don't really need much fungicide. So where peach scab is a problem, or you have cultivars that are sensitive, I think those sprays at shuck split and then maybe several sprays beyond that are the critical ones in terms of timing. But I haven't reviewed that recently, so somebody else could chime in if they have other information.
I'm just wondering, how much peach scab do you see? Because I see very little scab. I'll see, bacterial spot and brown rot, of course, but I don't, in commercial plantings, I don't see peach scab very much. How about the rest of you?
I never saw a lot.
I don't see it much up here. I'm sorry, Dave.
Well, I never saw a lot, but it would pop up occasionally. And I think often we would see it in both peach scab and leaf curl was worse in a year following a frost, because I do think the brown rot fungicides applied in summer helped to suppress those diseases. So in a year where they had no crop and no fungicides were applied, it would allow inoculum to build up for the next year. But then there's also cultivar differences and so forth. So Dan, what's your observation?
We don't see it much in Massachusetts. It's pretty similar what Heather said, that if there's a problem, it's brown rot, or we've had a year or two with bud blast problems, and then bacterial spot.
So do you think like a Captan program that they're using for their brown rot would kind of take care of it in most years, or would you recommend it if it does get bad, maybe throwing in some other type of single site material?
So for context, the grower that I was speaking with, he's never seen peach scab. And so he was just under the impression that he had to apply a couple sprays sort of during and post bloom specifically for peach scab. And that was kind of, I guess, my question to the group is, do you think that is it something that once it appears, it's hard to get rid of, and it's worth just prophylactically run that spray through every year? Or is it something that is so uncommon that maybe he waits until he sees it?
I don't know the answer to that. I think, as others have said, it's not that common in cold regions. For whatever reason, maybe it's the cultivars people are growing in the colder peach growing regions, or maybe it's the weather conditions, but we just don't see that much scab other than an occasional outbreak. But I think the bigger reason to put on a fungicide after shuck split is the recent article that Norma Lancet had in the New Jersey Ag Advisory newsletter, whatever they call it, showing that he got less brown rot pressure if he applied some kind of fungicide after shuck split. And his feeling was that there was quiescent infections occurring during that time period. Obviously, if it's dry, that's not a risk, but I guess my feeling is it's worth putting at least, one or two cover sprays of something. I'm just not sure what's the most economic and effective materials for that time slot.
And I know a lot of growers will use sulfur on those in between times, after shuck split, and because they like to keep some fungicide on the peaches, which seems like a good idea. But using sulfur is an inexpensive, stinky way to go.
Yeah, it's the other peach disease that pops up, at least in the Hudson Valley, is rusty spot, which is a mildew disease. Again, limited to certain cultivars that are sensitive. And that comes in during that period after shuck split as well. So sulfur obviously is a great mildewcide and it's inexpensive. I have to look at the data though as to its activity on scab. I think it's sort of marginal if you have scab pressure like they do further south.
So just a follow-up question. So it looks like in Norman's article, he had recommended one of the strobies like Flint Extra or Abound. He also mentioned how Abound has toxicity on apples. So, I mean, is that something, if you have mixed blocks, even something you want to potentially use? I see Dan shaking his head no.
Now, Abound is, it's interesting. It's causes damage on apples at levels that are too low to detect at least 20 years ago with residue measuring equipment. Parts per billion is enough to ruin apples. And so growers who think they've cleaned their sprayers may not always have cleaned their sprayers, and it's a real risk to use Abound in a sprayer in which you then spray apples. Again, for those of you not familiar, it's not all cultivars of apples. It's Macintosh and Gala, and I forget a few others, and then things like Red Delicious are not affected. But it can be extremely damaging. I purposely sprayed two variety blocks when I was working and didn't get as much reaction as I had hoped because it is affected by growth stage. And so depending on when that spray is applied and how quickly it dries and all those other things, the amount of damage really varies, but it definitely can ruin a crop. And some of you have heard the story, but the first time I became aware of it was back when ICI was selling the product, and the ICI rep came to visit me at the Hudson Valley lab and had some long branches in his lab and in the back of his pickup. And he took me out and said, "What do you think this is?" And I said, "Well, it's spray injury of some kind." And he went on to tell me that the grape growers in the Lake Erie area were using a lot of ultra low volume sprayers, King Kelders or Agtex, I forget which. And they liked to spray at night when there was no wind. They had gotten some of the Abound up into an inversion, and it carried over a mile to an apple farm. And I think ICI bought 40 acres of apples that year because the drift had moved with the inversion layer into the apple orchard. So even if you're not spraying anywhere close to apples, I think there's a lot of risk using Abound in an area that has apples within a mile or two, because and you can pinpoint what it is because we know which varieties are affected. So it's real hard for somebody to say, "Oh no, that can't be me," because if it's only a few varieties that are affected, you can go to court with the evidence that that's definitely Abound damage. And now the labels are written so the company's no longer liable, which makes the applicator liable.
All right, that's good to know. Thanks, Dave.
And Dave, can't it also kill trees and not just cause some, like, hasn't there been tree death, or is that overstated?
I don't know that I've seen tree death. In fact, in some orchards where I've seen it applied accidentally, or what I was going to mention before I answer that question is the big problem is people who are growing pumpkins, because it's sold under a different trade name in pumpkins, in veg crops, but it does just as much damage. So if you have a diversified direct marketer who's selling pumpkins, they'll buy the I think by now they've learned, but I forget the name in pumpkins. It might be Heritage, but I can't recall what name it's sold under. I think there's about 3 or 4 trade names now, plus generics. But I'm not aware that it kills trees. And in fact, I've seen cases where it killed off leaves and new leaves sprouted out pretty quickly thereafter if it happens in the spring. So it's mainly, the problem is twofold. It'll cause cosmetic damage on the fruit if it doesn't knock them off, but also you'll have illegal residues in those fruit if you then go to market with them. So even putting them in cider is debatable if you've once sprayed a bound on the tree, accidentally or enough drift to cause injury.
Or through vandalism, which we had a case of several years ago in our area. And that did not kill any trees, but they were not able to sell the apple crop because of the abound residue on the apple trees.
Wow. Just a neighbor feud, or
A resentful previous owner.
oh geez.
Yeah, it was. I mean, they tried to pursue it as much as they could, and I don't think any action was actually taken. But there were a couple of containers missing, and when the police went to the guy's house, he said, "Not without a warrant, you're not coming in here," and that was kind of the end of the episode. But yeah, it was a bad will kind of deal.
Wow. All right. Well, does that kind of take care of your peach question, Janet? Okay, great.
Yes, thank you.
If I could just throw in one more stone fruit comment. I think last week or maybe the week before, we talked a bit about Pseudomonas syringae and the bud blast issues. But one thing for those of you who have people growing apricots, I think Pseudomonas is more damaging on apricots than almost any other stone fruit because it goes systemic and it will run down the trunk almost like fire blight, except it doesn't kill the tree immediately. It just kills a strip of bark. I've had trees at the Hudson Valley Lab that survive 8 or 10 years with one section of dead bark running down the trunk. But for apricot growers, we really should be telling them to never prune their apricot trees when temperatures are below 80 to 85 degrees. And they're best pruned right during or after bloom, when you can also do some thinning, because you pick a hot, dry day, the pathogen doesn't survive heat well, and obviously can't infect in the absence of water very well. And then again after harvest. So if you prune apricots after bloom and after harvest, you can really minimize, you won't probably avoid, but you can minimize tree loss due to Pseudomonas. In the Hudson Valley, it wasn't uncommon for growers to lose half of their trees in the first 5 years due to Pseudomonas infection. Keeping them away from hedgerows and other potential sources of Pseudomonas may help, but apricots in the East are just difficult to grow because of that pathogen.
As far as bacterial canker goes in cherries, Dave, I think I've seen in one of the publications in years like this where bloom is kind of cool and wet, maybe consider a copper application. Is that something that you would recommend in a year like this, or what would you recommend as far as managing Pseudomonas bacterial canker?
Yeah, it's a real tough one. The Pseudomonas will get into leaf scars, so generally it's recommended to put on a couple of applications during leaf fall and autumn, and then again just before bud break. I don't think you can do it on cherries after bud break because you'll get a lot of toxicity from the copper. Although I'm not sure what people are doing. Again, that's one that doesn't have a good solution, but cherry growers in the Hudson Valley who have stuck with cherries have come up with a routine of maybe 2 fall applications and 1 in the spring. The dilemma is that some of the Pseudomonas carry some levels of resistance to copper, not total resistance, but again, there's some debate as to how useful those are, but it is a common practice, and I think was recommended in Ontario many years ago.
Is it the same critter that causes Matsu blister spot? Because I've heard of people using phosphite for blister spot successfully. Question mark, question mark, question mark.
Well, it's the same genus and species, but a subspecies, I think, that causes a blister spot. It's Pathovar papulans as opposed to Pathovar syringae. So what we have normally is Pseudomonas syringae, Pathovar syringae. In Mutsu, it's Pseudomonas syringae, Pathovar papulans. And for that, controlling a blister spot in Mutsu, the phosphites have been pretty effective. As long as you, and I think the recommendation was to apply them with a silicone spreader, because you really have to get uptake for it to work. Tom Burr did a lot of work using streptomycin. I think got a label for streptomycin, but then found after about 3 or 4 years, there was streptomycin resistance, and so it no longer worked well. I think some growers are still using strep mixed with phosphite and a silicone spreader sticker on Mutsus to keep it in check. Yeah, so it's the same general organism, but not identical in cherries. And in terms of using phosphites on cherries, I don't know if anybody's ever tested that. That's a good question.
Well, maybe we could shift gears a little bit. I do have an insect question. For whatever reason, the Champlain Valley seems to be really an oblique-banded leaf roller hotspot, sometimes more so than I think we think about codling moth. So I did have a question the other day about non-restricted use, or I guess we'd call them general use pesticides for oblique-banded leaf roller throughout the summer. But looking more in line with the calendar right now, should we be out sampling in the next upcoming weeks for the overwintering larvae? And when would a pink application or a bloom petal fall application make sense there, and what materials make the most sense for them?
Well, I can weigh in a little bit. So I think it's too early to be worried about obliques until you get to at least bloom, because I mean, they'll be out there as soon as it gets warm enough. The larvae will be out, and they might start taking a couple nibbles on some buds, but it's not going to do any real any damage until you get to the blossom stage, and that's when the larvae are almost full grown. And you could sample blossom clusters for obliques at that time. As for sort of a general use management approach, I think it's a good idea not to underestimate the usefulness of BT materials. Well, I mean, for the large larvae, they don't really they're not quite as susceptible. But just in general, I mean, if you're looking for something that's not restricted, BT works quite well when you use it at low rates. For instance, 1/2 ounce of dipel per acre as opposed to the 2-ounce rate, and in frequent applications, like every 7 days or so. And it really has been quite effective in those kinds of programs. So yeah, I mean, that's off the top of my head, that's one piece of advice people might take.
Okay, great. Thanks, Art. I know this grower was thinking probably using dipel, and I suppose another option for the later generation would be delegate.
Well, obviously, delegate is one of the top tier materials for all those tortricids, including leaf rollers. So yeah, I mean, if they want to spring for the cost of a delegate, they'll probably have good results, obviously. But for those, I mean, I usually would recommend holding off until you get to like the mid-stage instars of that summer brood, usually around mid-July. Maybe, up in your area, probably wouldn't be much before then. But yeah, it pays to look in the clusters just to see what stage you're at, because you're not going to be getting a lot of damaging larvae until you get to those 3rd or 4th instars.
So, Art, in the summer population for oblique-banded, I found it always difficult to get a relationship with the trap cast versus the actual fruit damage or the. So if there are blossom damage in the early season, is that will tell something for the summer infestation, or what is the best way to make a judgment about, okay, when a growers will be using BT versus the delegate? Because delegate is always very expensive.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the overwintering generation damage to blossoms and even, the early fruitlets is always an indication that you should be on the lookout for summer generation damage. Usually the damage that early generation does is almost unremarkable enough to just ignore, because it just, I don't know, it tends to just sort of thin off a few fruitlets, and most of the damage to fruits, those kinds of fruits drop off anyway, and they don't come through to harvest. But if you're noticing damage from that early generation, that means that you should be prepared to do some management decisions in the summer. And you're right, the amount of the number of moths that you catch in the traps doesn't really have any bearing on the larval pressure. It's something that you want to keep track of, mainly for purposes of tracking the development. So, putting up some traps to get the biofix, and then using degree days will give you a good handle on when to start considering the need for treatment. And we always say, basically, the larvae start to hatch something like 360 degree days, base 43 after the biofix. So that's like the beginning of the hatch. And the real treatable populations of those mid-stage larvae doesn't occur until you get to about over 600 degree days from the biofix. But I think that's probably in the guidelines. At any rate, yeah, the moth capture levels, tells you sort of in general terms what kind of population you have. But I would basically go on the basis of field history, and also, if you are able to detect early season generation damage in the blossoms and some of those fruitlets, that'll say,
So Art, if a grower has a history of oblique-banded leafroller damage, the next season, if they spray BT at blossom stage or something, is that will be helpful to avoid the delegate application in the summer? Like, is that will be helpful? Can we suggest, like, okay, you have a history of damage, and then just apply BT at the blossom stage?
I would say it would be a useful tactic to implement, although I don't know that it'll go so far as to eliminate the need for summer applications. It'll just, decrease the population pressure.
There will be more invasion, I think, from outside.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it just means that there's a very active population in the area. But if they're already in the trees at bloom, just applying some measures against that generation will help suppress sort of the severity level of the summer generation.
Okay.
But Art, I thought you were saying to go after that summer generation with the low dose of BT. So starting at what, like first cover or something, were you saying before? Or did I misunderstand that?
Probably, yeah. I mean, that the low dose of BT strategy is more recommended for the summer generation, and in that case I would go after the early hatching larvae. So when you get to that 350 360 degree day milepost after biofix, that's when you're going to be getting the youngest larvae. And several applications, two or three on a weekly basis at a low rate is something that we found is pretty good effectiveness.
Art, do you have any experience with mating disruption for OBLR? Maybe trying out the combo codling moth OBLR lure that Trace has now?
Yeah, I have experience with mating disruption of OBLR, and it's been bad experience. The short story is you can disrupt them from finding your traps. Okay, I mean, if you hang traps, if you've in a disrupted orchard, you probably get 0 captures. But unfortunately, obliques are capable of migrating in from long distances, and that includes mated females. So they can come from 5 miles away, and they don't care if it's a disrupted orchard, they'll still lay eggs in your orchard. So disruption for obliques is really not something that I would ever recommend. You just can't rely on it.
Okay, thanks.
Art, my impression is that we had a major oblique problem in the Hudson Valley, I don't remember, quite a long time ago. And then it subsided a bit. Maybe growers just learned to spray for it. And then they developed more of a problem in the Champlain. Do you agree with that observation, or is there a reason that it seems to go in waves?
Yeah, we've noticed that it goes, waxes and wanes all over the place, including Western New York. So some years it's really gangbusters, and those can be followed just as easily by a year in which they're hardly noticed at all, such as last year. We really hardly noticed any oblique populations, and we don't know the reason. Frankly, I mean, there's lots of variations in the population for whatever reasons. Could be, weather related, or some that they do get, affected by some insect diseases, and also some parasitoids, including tachinid flies and also wasps. So the long and short of it is we can't account for basically the ups and downs in their population. Does seem to be sort of spreading, the severe problems seem to be spreading very slowly into other areas where they haven't been seen. We never used to see them in the Champlain Valley 20 or 30 years ago, but it's not so unusual now, to come upon some problem populations up there. And then the same goes for the New England states.
Same for Long Island also.
Yeah, it never used to be really reported in very great numbers. So they had this persistent way of expanding their range. But the good news, if you can call it that, is that it's not always a bad year for leaf rollers. So that's why it's worth always sort of checking the terminals and even the blossoms, just to see what's going on in your trees.
Yeah, Art, it seems like the codling moth mating disruption works a little better. Are the females just not as mobile as obliques?
Oh yeah, I mean, mating disruption is definitely a tactic that you can use for codling moth. It's probably still something that you want to use as a complement to a good insecticide program. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in terms of the ease of disrupting things, moths, they go from really easy, like peach tree borers, to slightly more difficult, but still quite good for oriental fruit moth, to codling moth, which is less effective, but still, worth doing. And dogwood borer falls in that range too. And then obliques, just forget it. Don't even consider it.
That also relates to how many wild hosts around there are. Like the Oblique-Banded has more wild hosts than the oriental fruit moth, so their population will have a better chance to mate outside and come inside like this.
Well, it really has more to do with a combination of sensitivity to their own pheromone, such as peach tree borers and codling moth. Peach tree borers and oriental fruit moth are very sensitive to their mating pheromone versus codling moth. But also in there is obviously the migratory behavior and capability of the moths. So obliques are the champs. They can come from so far away that you'd really have to have an area-wide approach for it to be effective.
I love that hierarchy, Art. Thank you. Yeah, I remember hearing, yeah, some work well and some don't work well, so I appreciate having it.
Yeah, and it's for different reasons, but just in terms of our general growing practices in this region, those tend to be the big trends that I've seen.
It's a little spooky to think that dogwood borer is in the same category as codling moth, because I think we're kind of using that mating disruption as a replacement for insecticide, because we're losing the major insecticide there.
Well, I mean, once again, it's definitely a tactic that you want to include in your dogwood borer management program. And I would say that obviously if we don't have Lorsban to use as a trunk treatment, there are other things you can use. Don't work quite as well. I think a sail works fairly well, but it's sort of a double whammy impact that you're trying to have on the moths. And what was I going to say? So the site characteristics of your planting also impact effectiveness of dogwood borer mating disruption. So they will immigrate in not quite as far as is what you see in oblique-banded leaf rollers, but having heavy pressure immediately outside of the orchard definitely impacts the effectiveness of your management efficiency using mating disruption. So that's a thing where using it on as many acres as you can is more important for that species.
Okay, thank you.
You said all right, excuse me. So a sail you say works pretty well, and that's using it as a trunk spray. And then what else do you think is pretty good for the dogwood borer?
Dogwood borer, I think we only recommend a sail. I think that may be the only one that we've tested, or else is labeled. We did do a couple years of trials of trunk sprays using Avant, and 2 applications of Avant seemed to do pretty well. Once at petal fall and once in mid-July. Good, well enough to be able to recommend it if it were labeled. Now in New York, we can't label it unless it's on the label. I mean, we can't recommend it unless it's on the label. But I don't know, in other states it may be different. But I do know that FMC is looking at modifying the label of Avant to allow its use for borers. So that may be something that's becomes an option in the near future.
That would be great. Carculio control. Art,
well, yeah, I mean, this is, I'm saying recommending it as a trunk spray. So,
yeah. At what rate, Art, would it have to be? It's just at the highest rate you can go with the label? Is that what you did, do you know?
I'll have to look up the report, and I can send it out to you guys because I can't remember the rate offhand.
Art, do you see dogwood borers in trees that have no burr knots and smooth bark? I mean, they pretty much need an entry point, don't they?
Right. I mean, I think that obviously, I suppose theoretically it's possible for them to attack any tree, but they really are drawn to trees with burr knots because that's where the females like to lay the eggs. Yeah, I think that, failing that, they're not going to be such a threat. But dogwood borer is a pest that never used to be known as a real, reliable apple pest in every case. But over the years, as most orchards now are on size controlling rootstocks, and you get these kinds of burr knots. it's really something that you have to assume is going to eventually affect every orchard at some point in their lifetime.
And then also if they have, I mean, you hope that people have clean orchards, but if they've got the mouse guards on or some weeds along the tree trunks, don't you think that the dogwood borers can get in there and they don't need many burnouts? I see like the wraparound mouse guards, those white wraparound mouse guards. I'll see dogwood borers in there sometimes.
Right, and we found that unfortunately those mouse guards tend to promote burnout formation and protect, infestations that the sort of the initial infestations of those borers. So yeah, they kind of work counter to your efforts to control dogwood borer.
Mike, if I could make just a couple more comments. One, I knew there was two things I wanted to say about apricots. I know it's a minor crop, but I'm not sure how many people are aware that you cannot apply sulfur on apricots. If you look at, for example, the microthiol label, it specifically says avoid drift onto sulfur-sensitive things like apricots and cranberries. I did it once at the Hudson Valley lab because I figured out I've got sulfur in the tank. And what surprised me is the tree just stopped growing for about 10 days. And it was during peak leaf expansion. The terminal shoots should have been growing. And it's just like you put a wrench in the cogs and everything shut down. So it's something that, again, people who have a few apricot trees may need to be reminded that they shouldn't be putting sulfur on apricots. If they have, they probably pulled the apricots out, assuming they can't grow them, because it really shuts down apricots. The other disease coming up that, at least in the Hudson Valley and southern New England, we need to be aware of is quince rust. Quince rust is the one that doesn't show up on leaves, only on fruit. It's favored by intermittent wetting periods. And in my observation, the pink stage and the petal fall stage are peak susceptibility. I think we don't get as much during mid-bloom because I believe the petals which come out above the hypanthium prevent the spores from accessing that tissue where the fruit will be, which is what needs to be infected. Mancozeb usually gives pretty good protection, even at just 3 pounds per acre. But if you get into an extended wetting period where there's a question about having adequate Mancozeb protection due to wash off or whatever, the DMI fungicides, and I think all of them, but I don't have any experience with Sevia, but certainly myclobutanil, which is a Nova, Keith Yoder showed might have up to 2 weeks of kickback on this disease because it grows so slowly into the fruit that you can really knock it out with a petal fall spray if you miss something during bloom. If we have a fairly dry, normal year, it's usually not a big issue, but I've seen orchards in the Hudson Valley where over 50% of the fruit were infected when a grower missed a spray. So in a bad year, it can be devastating. And unlike the other rust diseases, it goes to virtually every cultivar, with Macintosh, I think, being the most resistant of all the cultivars we tested in terms of percent fruit affected. But so that's one I always sort of like people to keep in mind. It may never even need to be mentioned if the weather is fairly normal, but if you do get into an extended, like a 48-hour wetting period between pink and petal fall, and then have fungicide wash off, it can be devastating.
So Dave, is the cedar rust tree is a host for the quince rust also?
Yeah, quince rust comes from red cedar, but it doesn't form a very visible gall on the cedar tree. Cedar apple rust forms a really visible gall that puts out Philion horns in the rain. The quince rust infection in cedar shows up as little red lines of Philion horns that come out of cracks in the bark. So you'll never notice it unless you really go looking for it during a rain. when it's dry, you can't see it at all in cedar trees. But when it rains, if the cedar trees are wet and you look at some of the twigs and the bark and you see little reddish orange lines along cracks, that's a quince rust fruiting structure on the cedar trees.
It's really worth going to the Hudson Valley around early apple bloom to just look at the cedar trees and their bright orange color that they have at that time of year. It's spectacular, Dave. I don't see that level of infection anywhere else.
Rhode Island, come to Rhode Island, Dan. It's a little closer.
Okay.
Yeah, there's some, just down the street. I go every year and take pictures. I can't help myself.
We've had, 10, 15 foot tall cedar trees that get so many galls in the top that during a rain, the tip of the whole tip of the tree leans over towards the ground like an apple tree with a crop load, because they can create so much weight on the tree that it actually bows the tree down. It's too bad we can't get them to fruit just before Christmas.
Anybody else have anything else before we head out for the week? I do have one last quick question for Art, but we don't all have to hang around for it.
Let's hear your question, then we can decide whether we hang around.
Sure. A grower is looking, they think they have enough tarnished plant bug issues every year now that they want to do a pink application, but they also want to, not flare up their mites, not disrupt their pollinators. So, what materials are really left? That it seems like one of those, you want 3, but you can only have 2 kind of scenarios. So just wondering what material you would recommend they put on at pink.
For tarnished plant bug.
Yep.
So you mean you don't, aside from a pyrethroid, you mean?
Right.
No, hang on.
I guess they were asking, is it worth to go with Belief?
Well, Belief is effective against tarnished plant bug. So, I mean, it's, I don't know, I think it's a matter of debate as to how well it stacks up against the pyrethroid, but we rate it as highly as any of the pyrethroids. That's probably the only non-pyrethroid that has that higher rating. Avant has sort of a moderate impact and effectiveness. So I would say, I would say it's worth trying Belief. And this is, admittedly one of those areas that we never did a lot of trials against, the materials that were available, because they were mostly all pyrethroids. So, and plant bug is always difficult to predict. It's tough to set up a trial where you get decent results.
Sure.
So yeah, that's probably, I would agree with you. Probably Belief would be the one that I would tend to try first.
I have
Okay.
peach growers that use it because I think tarnished plant bug seems to be more of an issue in peach for us than it is in apple, and people seem to have been pretty happy with Belief. So that's anecdotal, but there it is.
I'll take what I can get. Thank you. All right. Well, we're 7 minutes past noon now. I know I've got to get back out to the field to finish pruning a thinning trial. So thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you all next week again.